Hi, we are now live from Turkish Pavilion at Venice Biennale. In today's roundtable session, we are hosting Theodore Spyropoulos. Hey, Theodore. We will share a short summary of his background with you and turn the floor over to Theodore again. He's an architect and educator and the director of Architectural Association's world-renowned Design Research Lab, also known as AADRL, in London. He has been visiting research fellow at MIT's Center for Advanced Visual Studies and co-founded the New Media and Information Research Initiative at the AA. In 2002, his brother Stephen Spyropoulos, he co-founded the experimental architecture and design practice Minima Forms. Their work has received international attention, which have included nominations for the International Chernikov Prize in Architecture, named one of the top 10 international public art installations by The Telegraph for the work Memory Cloud, and most recently, they were awarded the Best Idea/Creative Work in the 5th Chinese International Beijing Biennale. Recent projects include 2 thematic pier landmarks and the illumination concept for Renzo Piana's Master Planned National Park in Athens, a large-scale land art work in Norway, a behavior-based robotic installation for the Frag Center, and immersive ephemeral environments for the city of Detroit. Previously, Theodore has worked as a project architect for the offices of Peter Eisenman and Zaha Hadid. And in 2013, AADRL awarded him the Acadia Award of Excellence for his educational work directing the AADRL. And lastly, he received his B.Arch from the New Jersey Institute of Technology, his M.Arch from the Architectural Association, and his PhD from UCL Bartlett School of Architecture. So that's all from us right now. We are giving the floor to you, Theo. Thank you so much.
Okay, no, thank you so much for that. I thought I could share a certain kind of, let's say, pathway, very much in terms about how architecture, in an expanded sense, could kind of offer a way to speculate on problems. And those problems, in many ways, I think, are very speculative for us, in particular with minima forms and with the DRL. And our approach towards architecture and art and design in some way is really about constructing a certain sensibility about how people can communicate with each other, can communicate with machines, and how machines themselves have agency and can communicate with other machines. So in a sense, our definition of architecture is close to what Hans Hollein, the late Hans Hollein, spoke when he made this provocation that everything was architecture. He said the true architecture of our time will have to redefine itself and expand its means, and many areas outside of traditional building will enter the realm of architecture, as well as architects enter into new fields. And I think that's very much where we sort of reside within. I'll show you just a short video just to give you a bit of a sense of the kind of different projects and things that we're sort of working on. They're all premised with an idea of human interaction, really engaging and much more emotive, and what we call behavior-based design. We basically don't believe in blueprints or master plans, and we're always looking for adaptive models to think about how architecture design can really somehow evolve with us. And we believe that that happens when architecture participates really in a much more emotive and an enabling way to really foster curiosity and to enable people to participate. So a lot of the projects, regardless of scale, it could be at the scale of an interface, it could be an atmosphere, or it could be working at the scale of a city. We're always trying to look and explore in novel ways of how people can sort of engage things. And a lot of the things that we do is really much about prototyping ideas. We speak about prototyping futures, but in some way our attitude to the future is very much about seeing how things operate in the present. It takes an idea of Marshall McLuhan, which is if you're interested in the future, look to the present because we live in the past. So we want architecture really to be much more sensorial And we want it really to sort of really evolve and to learn from us and to challenge us in some way. So a lot of the work that we do really uses making as a very fundamental way of sort of discovering things and making that accessible to people. So when we speak about architecture learning, we want architecture to be really self-aware, to understand that the environment has agency and that people are very much a part of that environment. So we're interested in human to human, human to machine, and machine-machine interactions. Some of these ideas of anticipation, anticipatory architectures have a history. People like Cedric Price and other kind of provocateurs within the world of architecture who in some way just basically demanded that architecture demand more. Using kind of space as an interface, we're really trying to challenge, I think, our conception of how we actually see our environment today. In this kind of world, I think it's important to realize that architecture in a more expanded sense has been really at the forefront of kind of provoking new ideas and new sensibilities. This is an image of the Architecture Machine Group, which was a research lab at MIT set up by Nicholas Negroponte, which basically challenged new tools for architects. And that 10-year experiment turned into something called the Media Lab afterwards, and we know where that went into the world of communication. And I think it's kind of important as we sort of situate what we're doing today to think about that our environments are also intelligent, and that's capacity to learn. Even something like a Hoover, like a self-cleaning system, has a way of trying to understand the world. This world, I think, is very nuanced because it becomes a way to really see how we can sort of construct a kind of idea which maybe is even more animalistic. We've had a history of kind of projects within Minima Forms that kind of explore some of these ideas. I thought I'd speak a little bit about the sensibility of things and then show a project like Face Breeder and maybe Petting Zoo, which is maybe more relevant to the workshop that you guys are undertaking. But it started, I think, with a certain project like Becoming Animal, which we were really looking at how human behavior, how a system could sort of see and understand each other could become much more performative and performance-driven. And a lot of the things that I do with my students in the DRL also uses making and prototyping as a way to really sort of build new relationships with things. We're very much interested, I think, very much in the kind of human aspect of technology. We believe, in some sense, technology today is culture. And when we construct these things, we start to understand how people sort of relate to them, how they understand the world, and how these things themselves can understand us. A lot of the work that we're doing is always negotiating, I think, in a kind of real-time way, this relationship between the digital and the analog. So even something like a unit or a brick or an aggregate has to have a certain sensibility of understanding itself as a body in the world, and its relationship to other bodies. So we always try to think about things in a much more adaptive or evolutionary manner, about how taxonomies of things can interact with other things. And the possibilities of that and the potential is something that is a very creative and a forward-thinking kind of process. And I mentioned Cedric Price briefly. Cedric Price always really spoke that technology was the answer, but he followed it up with what was the question. And I think that this is where the body today, this kind of animalistic approach, actually has an interest. When we see how technology is really refactoring the way that we communicate, the way that we understand each other, the way that we understand ourselves, when we see it in the history of how machines also understand the world, this is a very ongoing and long-standing project. This is 100 years worth of mechanical automatons in this diagram. If you look at today, even roboticists like Hiroshi Ishiguro are trying to basically reconstruct themselves, and in a way, very quickly losing the boundaries of actually what makes us actually human. Is it the identity of the physical presence of the body, or is it the behavior? Is it the learning strategies of how one sort of understands the experiences that are being shared? And aside from this kind of more anthropocentric ideas, we also have these ideas where things like even a chair, in a certain world, in the world of, let's say, Raffaello di Andrea here, tries to understand its relationship, its own body and its own presence as what constitutes a chair for itself. So in a sense, in a kind of trial and error moment, it tries to reconstruct its body by first understanding what constitutes its own sort of taxonomy of elements that actually constitutes the chair itself. These things are very much a part, I think, of a certain strategy that we sort of look at between hard systems or soft systems and soft bodies. And in a way, we're always trying to kind of prototype how we can sort of put those things out into the world. We don't really believe the world is this kind of habitual and static place. It behaves at times in this way. We sort of construct certain understandings of it in this manner. But realistically, particularly with minima forms and the work that I do with my students in the DRL, it's really about thinking about things as lifelike, that they're behavioral, that they basically are moving towards models that are dynamic. We don't believe in the fixed and the finite. And that the idea of a body itself is really almost in an evolutionary developmental biology sort of sensibility, really about understanding its sort of physical elements and understanding how we can sort of opportunize that. So we do a lot of self-assembly, self-strategy development, where even robots, like some of the earlier things, start to understand its own body. And by adding a new element or a leg, it starts to understand itself in a different way. It could walk, or it could crawl, it could roll. And this idea of body, I think, something that I think would be important for maybe some of you guys to consider is, what does it mean today to actually have a collective body? A lot of the work that we do deals with really high resolution of very distinct elements that all have their own kind of legibility. But the interest of those things is how those things actually can communicate to each other, and in a way, through communication, construct something that's more than the individual elements themselves. And that here is a self-assembled system that was being developed in the DRL called Hypercell, which shows basically 300 elements or 500 elements coming together, having certain goals and organizing themselves. One of the first projects that we did, I think very explicitly to try to speak a little bit about this early on, especially the role of the body and technology, was a project that we did with Vasilis Strumpakos called Face Breeder. And it was based on an invitation from Archogram's David Green to construct a future vision of what London would be. Our argument was that the city of London was a hybridizing cultural machine, and that basically the best way to sort of speak to that and to invite people to participate was through the idea of portraiture. So we were given with a very modest budget, a lot of very old computers that were being thrown away. And we sort of disassembled them and reassembled them into something that we called a portrait machine. FaceBreeder, the concept of that was really about constructing a system. It was the first time that we started to look at the idea of the body and the idea of identity from the perspective of portraiture. And we constructed a very simple device for people to sort of participate and to sort of like in a photo booth contribute their image to this machine. And through that process, people started to become very playful with it. There was no instructions for it, other than the fact that we thought that through people's participation, very human aspects would be somehow demonstrated within the machine. Here you start to see people continuously adding to the database, sometimes not happy with the image that they first took, or sometimes being very playful with the camera itself. The machine itself was not really about the physicality of the computers and that stuff. In some sense, these were all obsolete elements. It was much more about sort of constructing a way or an interface to actually sort of tease out human behavior. So the 3x3 grids, I'm going to switch over for a second to a website that you guys can have a look at, which is facebreeder.com. If we launched the FaceBreeder machine, every time someone was inputting their portrait, the system basically worked by basically adding their image to them. And through the continuous addition of that, basically almost like in a collage, hyper collage way, it was recording that with these Face ID tags and basically constructing what were kind of monstrous portraits. So individual images of people basically being spliced in a 3x3 grid like a Chuck Close painting started to have these kind of monstrous hybrids, and we allowed people basically to be able to breed their own versions of that. And basically if you click on the archive element, you start to see a recording of all of these kind of hybridized elements. So in many ways, I think what we were doing with FaceBreeder was trying to really make people more aware of their own identity and their own presence and how it related to other people. Maybe some of the most recent things that we've been doing relative to the body is that we've been asked, I think, on a few occasions now to really work somewhere between architecture and fashion. And a lot of our early work had a lot of body-centric elements to it. Prosthetics, some of the stuff that I was doing at MIT. This project, Swarm Body, was this idea that if we could create a relationship where we sort of completely dissolve our idea of fashion as textiles and apparel, and we thought about it much more as this kind of symbiotic relationship with these kind of lifelike creatures, and that these creatures could attach to the body in more performative ways if we were moving, or they could actually disengage with the body and create these kind of spatial envelopes like a pod. These are closer to kind of ideas of the cushicle and things that Mike Webb from Archogram and David Green had. In some way, looking at a very different resolution and also sort of challenging this kind of conception. So it was more of a kind of sketch to think about the relationship between how we think about our own kind of mobile environments and then how those things can sort of look in a more deployable sense with these kind of strategies that are much more understood in swarm systems. I think I'll conclude by speaking a little bit about petting zoo, because we took a lot of those kind of human elements that we spoke about in our early work and somehow tried to construct a prototype that would actually have some of those animalistic behaviors in itself. And petting zoo, I think, is an interesting project because over time, it sort of developed into really trying to understand the relationship of how one constructs a prototype. And a lot of aspects of the project that basically maybe people are not as aware of is actually how the thing itself sees people, how it can communicate with them. And I think here on these screenshots, you basically see what the actual robot itself is seeing. The project was basically constructing these artificial AI robots. It was shown at the Frac at the Barbican. It's been touring for the last 4 years. And here you see through blob detection, you start to see different ways that the pets themselves, using a Kinect camera, are basically identifying people within a field. And they are also able to identify other pet elements. So within the Frac, they could see other pets, and they could stimulate each other as well as being stimulated by human agency. When we worked at the Barbican Center, we wanted to basically put that out in the general public, not in a black box, and to see how they would interact. And the piece itself, even if it looks a bit of a kind of alien intervention, actually sat very comfortably there, and people felt, I think, quite not shocked in terms of basically interacting with these things. But when we start to construct and try to break down what all of those is, it was basically looking at behaviors that we wanted to embody in the physical element itself. So illumination was a very important thing, sound and kinetics. And the combination of all of these things, the acceleration, deacceleration, all of these different elements basically constructed, I think, a lot of the sort of behavioral communication that the system itself was actually having. And when we first started out, because this was evolving over a couple of years, we were really trying to test, I think, different ways of understanding the body. So an individual body could be seen in like a blob detection mode, but when we have multiple people interacting or in different proximities to the piece, we had to sort of start to see how gesture, individual gesture, could really participate in that. And that, I think, became a very important way of thinking about also the role of simulation and how all of these things, in some sense, are really interconnected. A lot of this stuff, I think, in some way, obviously evolves over time, but in a similar manner, like almost like in a workshop mode, a lot of these ideas with Stephen and my colleagues really were sort of teased out in kind of very intense moments when we were just trying to have very open ideas and speculations about how we could develop some of these things. And Petting Zoo in some way started out as a personal project, in some ways sort of responding to the things that we were doing with Memory Cloud, which was just really more about atmospheres. And the interesting thing about shows and works like that, when you put them out into the world, is also how the world somehow makes sense of some of that. So we got a lot of press for projects like this, but for very different reasons sometimes. Some of them were really about how people thought that we were trying to replace animals in zoos, and we didn't believe that animals should be in cages. Other things thought that these were like jellyfish in the Barbican that would, you know, attack you and all of this other kind of stuff. And then we had stuff like this, which was like a quite intense day of interviews with a Russian broadcast. And I'm pretty sure that you don't understand Russian like I don't. But I had one of my students translate it to me. And basically what the premise was is that me and my brother Stephen have been living in London for 15 years. And we never had gone to the zoo, so we created our own zoo. And it's kind of one of those things where you can't really make this kind of stuff up. The reality of the thing was that a lot of the conversations around the work that we were doing and the projects that we were doing, I think it unlocks a certain imagination in people, and their imagination runs sometimes quite wild with some of the things that they think. I think what was interesting at the end of this was actually that the premise was that she, you know, the interviewer thought that she hopes that we don't just design animals in the future, but that we also work to design new humans as well. And in some way, this is the world that we're really occupying these days. We're occupying a world where the boundaries between what is alive and what is not are really becoming very tenuous and loose. And they may not even be relevant anymore. I think when you see some of the early robotics of Rodney Brooks and other characters like this, they also thought the same, that in some sense the boundaries of actually how we see human interaction in the future, not only with machines but with each other, will be for sure augmented through technology. And I think technology, for at least me and Stephen and in a lot of the projects that we're doing, is really to try to see technology as something that's very human. We don't see it as something that's outside of us. We see it as something that's very much part of how we operate in the world. So I think with that, maybe I finish with a presentation, if that's okay, and I could open it up for questions if there's anything that people would like to talk about. Is that okay?
Okay, I think I will be the first one to ask a question. Having listened to your projects, that I infer that human interaction is a crucial point in your architectural standing. I mean, especially in the face reader, the interaction of participants plays a huge role. That the parts creates a new whole, a different identity. So this tension between the digital and the physical immediately made me recall this year's Biennale theme, free space. So my question will be, how would you relate this tension to the issue of free space regarding your own thoughts about the matter?
Yeah, I think for us, I mean, it's the digital and the analog has always been something that we've tried to subvert. We don't really believe in basically those distinctions in themselves kind of offering something that's very important. We're very much interested in things that are much more real-time and anticipatory. And a lot of the work that we've done has always been about kind of enabling curiosity and then enabling participation. And so our systems that we design are very much kind of like frameworks for people to engage in. And that's how we sort of really try to use space as an interface. Memory Cloud, which I spoke about, is one of the largest kind of public participatory interventions in London, which we did in Trafalgar Square. And that, in terms of free space, even if it's a public space and it's a space where people celebrate and they protest, we created basically a vehicle for them to speak through smoke signals and other elements like that. And in some way, be able to really communicate with each other. So I think it's very important to sort of create kind of mechanisms to allow people to really engage and to participate. Sorry, I thought that you could see me, but I realized you were just seeing my screen. And I think that that's kind of very important because I think, like, realistically speaking, architecture has agency. And sometimes that means to explore ideas that go beyond building. So I think in the Biennale, if I'm honest, I haven't been. But the concept of free space is something that people don't necessarily interrogate as something that's time dependent and things that are evolving. So how do you really sort of engage people and how do people basically evolve with the space? I think a lot of the things that we do are very much about sort of developing adaptive systems. And sometimes that pushes us in places where, you know, traditional building is not the answer. So we really look at technology as being a way to sort of evolve and to expand, I think, the brief of what architecture is in a very radical and progressive way. Is that okay?
I was wondering, what are your thoughts about the relationship between technocracy and architecture? Since you said technology is a culture and technology is human, so I was wondering how could we talk about the relationship between our architecture and the technoculture. Our architects are going to be technocrats soon in the future, or what are your thoughts, please?
Yeah, I mean, I have to be honest. From my perspective, I don't believe in sort of technocrats, and we don't necessarily foreground technology. But I speak about technology, I think, because very very specifically, I think people have this approach toward technology that it's something outside of us. And when you speak beyond designers and architecture, there is a certain kind of fear-mongering when it comes to technology, when it comes to systems observing things. And very much because when the technology is out in the world, it can be used for certain purposes, but it could also actually be explored in different ways as well. So technology can't really go back in the box, no matter how much people don't want to sort of participate in that. And I think it's very important for young designers and architects to really engage with their times. And the contemporary day-to-day, I think for architects, and to be honest with you, every citizen right now, is to really sort of engage with the tools of today. That doesn't necessarily mean that those tools are better or not, but they may be more appropriate for some of the problems and challenges that we are facing and some of the projects that we're working on. So I think realistically speaking, I don't think a lot of architects are really engaged in technology. We are probably one of the most backward professions when it comes to that. There's a small community of people, I think, that are really trying to advance and progress architecture. One of the ways to deal with our kind of accelerated and hyper-communicative every day is really to sort of embrace some of these things and to see how that can enable architecture really to participate in a lot of different aspects in life. I'm unapologetic about the fact that I think design is very important. And I think realistically speaking, our way to really participate is also to make things accessible. And the information age allows us to be able to do that. It's not just about scripting geometries, it's also constructing new languages for how our objects, our things in the world, engage with other objects and things.
Thank you for your inspiring lecture. To follow to your thought about our discipline is a very slow, engaging technology discipline. I wonder, in your thought, right now, how we can, because we also kind of working with another discipline, for example, construction, the development of the new material. So in terms of authorship as the architect, what is the direct way for us to engage with technology right now that may be productive? So I can see now is a lot of tool that allow us to create a new way of designing. But when it's going to the physical construction of the building right now, can you share with us what is the challenge right now in order to apply kind of the research or the investigation that you've been developing? Thank you.
Of course. I mean, I can say that there's no real easy answer for this, but I think that there has to be a kind of acknowledgement that there is a community of people that have been exploring a lot of these ideas and kind of sharing and making that accessible and working together. I think allows, us the capacity to basically be much more adventurous with how we think about the built environment. We're living in a very radical period socially. Our contemporary condition, I think, is amazingly radical. We have such an accelerated time frame, and people basically want things instantaneously. So then how does architecture participate in this? I don't think it's slowness, literally, in terms of how long time it takes to make a building is a problem. I think the problem is that we are not basically pushing forward with better ways or asking how we can ask better questions about how we basically create things in the world. More sustainable way, in a more resourceful way, in a, all of these things, I think working through some of the challenges that we do in research, I think it gives us opportunities to be able to test and to prototype some of these ideas. We are not in the 60s and 70s where things were much more optimistic culturally, and people were much more open to take certain risks. I think realistically at the moment now, a lot of the things that are being motivated is very much based on economy. But even that, to be honest with you, through design research, there are ways to basically demonstrate that we could deliver things that are much higher quality, ask more of architecture, and I think deliver something that for the general public would actually be much more meaningful. But I think we have to upgrade the conversation, and we also have to accept that we're living in a very particular time. And I think architecture is something that evolves over time. It's not to basically say that building is always the answer either. So I think the idea of speculation and the idea of sort of working together and developing these ideas is very important. And I think the approach that architects that work in a very particular manner, because at the moment everything is spoken about as research, but very few things are, is to have that kind of sustained dedication towards things and to really sort of work almost like Buckminster Fuller used to speak about. You know, his idea of an experiment was 50 years. Now, that was his life's work, was an experiment. That's how he saw it. And I think in some way, when we're working collectively, we accelerate the learning curve of a lot of these things, but also demonstrate through prototyping that we basically have the capacity to really speak about things in a very informed way. And I see that in our work. A lot of the work that you saw, that's me and my brother and a couple of colleagues, not computer scientists, not roboticists, but I speak about robotics in places like Toyota and Festo. I've made presentations at Ferrari and other companies. I've worked for people like Zaha and Peter Eisenman, and I know the problem of non-standard form and all of these other things. All of these things are amazing challenges in the world today. And I think it's very important for the younger generation to learn also from some of our mistakes and to really push forward, because it's never been as easy now to learn how to develop surfaces. It's never been as easier to do parametric design. But yet, if I'm honest, the skills that are going across the world are very little. There hasn't been so much development in this. When you see how accessible things are, you would really think that it would really be something that people would want to actually try to understand how to use, and in a way to make that much more authored by them. So people have a certain reservation because these things are very difficult, that it will somehow not allow them to author things in the right way or whatever. But I take the opposite approach, actually. Just like every instrument, when you learn how to play something, you really can start to become very creative. So I just trying to be encouraging to young people to really try to explore things and not to be afraid of actually failure and not be afraid of actually testing ideas and challenging yourself to really create things. I think that's part of this workshop that you're with, as a way to sort of creatively think about ideas. To do that, I think you really have to also take some risk. If it's habit and you know it, maybe you're not really asking the right questions. And I think a lot of my students actually also branch off into many different fields, open up their own startups. Like one of my colleagues, Mustafa, he has with his partner Suryansh, opened up Automata, which is trying to democratize robotics as a startup. It's basically one of the hottest so-called startups in London at the moment. Different fields are open to us, and I think architectural education and these tools allow us to basically migrate and participate in very different conversations. So I don't believe that I believe people should choose their own path of how they see they want to participate. I think some of these things actually really enable us to do that in a way that actually is completely unique in the history of architecture as far as I'm concerned.
How you get the feedback, or maybe do you need the feedback from the humans, or these are more like laboratory experiments? So I mean, I'm asking for the multi-technological works actually. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, to be honest with you, it's not like a lab experiment. Like I put little mice in a vitrine and see what happens. I think we learn a lot from how people engage things, because realistically speaking, the way that we're sort of constructing these environments, they're very human-centric. So, for example, in Face Breeder, we wanted to create something which was just about people contributing their portraits. So we didn't want to have somebody standing there demonstrating the thing. We basically wanted to make something that anybody could sort of use as a piece of industrial design and that they could contribute something. In Memory Cloud, you sent an SMS. In other projects which are much more machinic, like Petting Zoo, like other things, we really try to understand how people try to engage things, how things communicate with them. We may have speculations, but when we sort of test in a very prototypical environment and sort of set up installations to sort of learn from these things, we get a lot of feedback. And that feedback is very important as we continue to develop the work, because these are like live experiments. Sometimes people think in some of the work that we do that we just believe in these kind of ephemeral structures. I do a lot of architectural projects as well. We have a project that we're working on right now, which are this glass sculpture, 5.5 meter diameter piece that's going to happen in Somerset House. A lot of the things that we're working on is always trying to sort of see different ways of how we can sort of activate space. So I think the human participation for us, particularly in Minima Forms, I think is absolutely fundamental. That's how we sort of evolve. That's how we sort of really develop things. And I think that's also why some of these projects have had the success that they've had in their own world. And Petting Zoo has been traveling, I think, a lot more than I have these days. It's halfway around the world, going from continent to continent. And in some way, in this kind of semi-autonomous kind of way of creating things and putting them out in the world, I think can be a very beautiful thing, because I still log in to see how it's recognizing, if its behaviors are changing and evolving. We developed a system that its personality would evolve with how it interacts with people. And I think those kind of things for me continue to sort of maintain a curiosity, even in projects that we did 3-4 years ago.
Okay, we have a final question also from me. What would be your predictions for the tools of the future? I mean, you use lots of multidisciplinary tools to create your work, and obviously there can be a prediction of yours that will used by the future generations, maybe.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's kind of important to say is that in the DRL and in Minima Forms, we don't really have an infrastructure of very highly technological tools. And we basically try to use design as a way to really augment and to use design as something that's fundamentally instrumental. I think the idea of the tool in a much more kind of, maybe even in an old school Greek way, was very much about bringing forth, about trying to communicate and try to create through something. So this idea of tools in the future and tools of today, I think sometimes we learn a lot by revisiting, I think, some old school ways and old technologies. When we speak about technology, it's in the idea of techni, which at the root of it is the art of bringing forth. It's not about like the latest gadgets and things like that. It's fundamentally about how we sort of work with things. And some are digital by the nature of the tools that we're using, but some of them, and a lot of them, if I'm honest, have to deal with matter and have to deal with the physics of things. And we're always trying to sort of capture material behavior and not to treat materials as something that's inert, but actually that also have their own life cycles. So I think really the most important thing is basically how we approach the experiment and how we approach the idea of research. If it is about discovery, and if you can arrest, I think, certain behaviors and you can capture the magic in how materials operate in the world, how things go through phase changes and have life cycles, I think you can really explore an architecture that very few people have. If you look at something like the Blur building of Diller and Scofidio, constructing a cloud, in some way, that was constructing an atmosphere. We did our memory cloud project. That's how people understood it, communicating through a cloud. I think that there's a way to really understand that at the moment, we don't give people too much credit, but the everyday, I think, is much smarter than I think we speak to. And I think it's very important for architects to actually understand that they have a responsibility, regardless of how experimental or how radical, to really communicate and to put work out into the world that allows people to really discover and to actually make sense of it. So your question and the previous question, I mean, we use installations as a way of really kind of exploring that. And that becomes a very important device for practices that are much more experimental, because that's the way that we learn from things. And as we materialize things and things get more permanent, we don't want to actually, let's say, become more conservative in our approaches. Quite the contrary. I think we want it to be much more adaptive and much more understood. And by that, it means that it has to become much more inclusive of other people. Because at the moment, we can spend 3 years developing something and learn all the things that we need to do that, and we're committed to that, so that's fine. But when we're working on projects that are much larger scale, that are building oriented, we have to be able to clearly communicate what we're doing, and the prototypes become a way to demonstrate that to people. But it also constructs an understanding. And I think that that's really, I think the idea of prototyping, which is not like illustrating ideas, but is really about demonstrating ideas, is really the tools for architects in the future. And like I said, I think the future is today. I believe that there's an urgency in architecture in particular, which is really receding in a place where it likes to just talk about ideas and not really committed to actually doing them. And I think biennales and so forth, and why I'm happy to participate in this, is that it is a platform to have a conversation about things. And this is probably the most fundamental thing to happen. But conversation built on respect and an attitude about how to progress architecture forward. This isn't against history or against architecture as we know it. It's about actually being more inclusive and diverse in terms of what that word means, which, if I asked any of you, I'm sure you would all have very different definitions, and I think that that's a positive thing. That's why we have to construct a framework that allows for that diversity. And that's where I think technology plays a role. So I hope that is a little bit useful for you guys. Just if there's other
I think that was all of our questions. Theodore, if you don't have anything to add more, we would like to thank you for your time and amazing speech and answering for our questions. Thank you.
Good luck with your workshop.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.